Thank you, and Michelle and Lewis and Michelle for inviting me to join you all today. And first of all, I'm hoping that each one of you, that you're doing well, that there's safety in your life, that there's more progress and new doors opening. I think that this is a very difficult time, one of the most difficult I think I've ever seen when I talk with executives and people and personal lives and so on. And before I get into my topic with organizations, just a little bit personally what's going on in terms of my emotions and so on right now. Um, so a couple days before Mother's Day, there was a really wonderful thing on, I think it was on one of the medias, and it was a picture of our globe and, you know, the blue marble. And on it, it said, "Love your mother." And it so happens that my mother is living right next to us right now. Um, my dad passed away some years ago. But then after I was thinking about that and that image of the planet and the role of the maternal in our lives. But what happened that day was Nancy went over there to my mom's and found her in the middle of a stroke. So it was challenging, and I rushed her to the hospital as quickly as I could. I figured I'd get there quicker than an ambulance would, and that was a good choice. But what was so, I guess I should have known it in this pandemic time, but as I'm trying to walk her into the emergency room, of course, they wouldn't let me come in. And, one of the features of the stroke was that she was just unable to speak. It was like word salad, no words connected. It was like a computer motherboard, breaking down. And so that was the hardest part for me. To just, and we all know people who are in healthcare situations like that, and they go in alone and so on. Anyway, and then Mother's Day comes around, and fortunately I did have good communication with the emergency room, and they let me talk to my mom, and her voice was back, and it was just beautiful. And she said, "David, I woke up at 4 a.m. and I could speak again." And she said, "I sang songs for the next 3 hours." I said, "Mom, what did you sing?" And she said, I sang "You Are My Sunshine." I sang "Beautiful Savior." I sang "Rockabye Baby." And anyway, I share that with you, that we're on roller coasters right now emotionally. And anyway, yesterday she did come home. And so I didn't tell Michelle because I didn't want to, I fully intended to make it today. But I think that we are living in a time that's incredibly challenging. And one of the things that you all know in terms of my work and my big passion today is around change. But, when we meet with leaders in every place that I go, their questions about change have shifted. Their questions about change are not just about change per se, but it's change at the scale of the whole. How do we move this 67,000 person telecommunications company together? How do we move a whole Northeast Ohio depressed economic region together? How do we move a whole United States Navy together? And so those are, that's where my passion has been. And you all know the features of the Appreciative Inquiry Summit, where we bring 500 to 1,000 people into the room for 3 days to discover and dream and design together. And one of the greatest insights in my career has been how the experience of wholeness brings out the very, very best in humanity and human beings and human listening and capacity to collaborate, bringing the customers into the creative conversation, bringing external stakeholders and communities, bringing the whole universe of strengths together. So, in these times, the question for me has shifted a little bit. Michelle mentioned a little article that I wrote called Appreciative Inquiry in a Broken World. And I'm talking about a broken world, not just in terms of this pandemic and the uncertainties and volatilities and pains and sufferings that are happening now, but also what's coming in terms of climate urgency, the need to reinvent every industry, the need to reinvent every company, the need to cut our emissions as a planet by 50 within 10 years, which is almost unfathomable that we could do that, and so on. So I think our field is ever increasing. As a human family, we've been sleepwalking through the last 3 decades as it relates to the issues on our planet, and the future of a world of 50% species loss by 2050. Well, how do we even grapple with that in our minds and our young people? And our young people are standing up in front of our world leaders and saying, wake up, it's time that we learn from this kind of mobilization and cross-sectoral relationships that are happening with this pandemic, and can we begin to bring together business and government and civil society and so on. So I honestly think this work is more important than ever, but what an intriguing puzzle we've been placed with in terms of physical distancing, but the need for social connectivity and collaboration at a scale the world's never seen before. When I say at a scale the world's never seen before, we can, when we think about the 17 global goals that we have today that are a remarkable achievement in themselves and a platform for coming together. But we don't even have the language for talking about this kind of macro mobilization, when we look at for metaphors of collective action, we can say the global eradication of smallpox, which was so successful, but that pales in significance to what our world is being called for today. We can look at, the healing of the ozone layer, but that pales in consideration and in relationship to what's being called for in terms of human cooperation and global action. We can talk about the putting a person on the moon. Again, that pales. We can talk about the Marshall Plan to rebuild a Europe. Again, that pales. We don't have the language for the level and scale and importance of this work that's happening. So anyway, one of the questions I often get is, David, I can understand appreciative inquiry in times that are extraordinary and excellent, and we can see strengths and so on, but what about times of utter breakdown, of utter uncertainty, and how do we even hold the space, to bring people together under those conditions? Jeannie Cockle and Joan, they wrote a wonderful book on appreciative inquiry and resilience, and in that I had a chance to reflect a little bit about some of these kinds of questions, and there's just if you can picture a little model in your head of a triangle, and the rungs going up in the triangle. And I think at each rung going up, we're seeing more profound skill required to do appreciative inquiry, and more profound, long-lasting impact and potential in that. So at the lowest level of appreciative inquiry, and the easiest level, it's appreciative inquiry into the extraordinary, what we might call positive deviations, Olympic moments that stand out, and seeing those and studying those and elevating those and so on. think the second level of appreciative inquiry, which is much more difficult, requires a different kinds of sensitivity and capability, is appreciative inquiry, not in the appreciative inquiry in the extraordinary, but appreciative inquiry into the ordinary. So here you can think about the gifted artist. You can think about a Van Gogh who can take a simple vase of flowers, very common, but turn it into something that has meaning and movement and imagination and makes a contribution to the aesthetic beauty and so on. And then the third level, I think, of appreciative inquiry is appreciative inquiry under conditions of tragedy. And this is the most challenging level, but potentially the most rewarding. Think about the whole, man's search for meaning, and this concentration camps and so on. When you start thinking about appreciative inquiry into conditions where there is immense suffering and tragedy, I think, like Viktor Frankl talked about, just how incredibly important it is to hold the suffering, to embrace that suffering, but within that suffering, there are glimpses of light and so on that we can grab onto. And of course, he shifted whole fields based on what he did in conditions where there was absolute tyranny and uncertainty and suffering and everything taken away. And so I think one of the things I want to put out is that appreciative inquiry, it's not about positive or negative. A lot of people have said, David, what about, is appreciative inquiry all about the positive? And I think appreciative inquiry is a search that transcends that polarity, positivity and negativity. It's the search for what gives life to living systems when they're most alive, when they're most making meaning and so on. So what does that have to do with this particular moment? I think at this time, I think there is one silver lining, is that we are seeing it everywhere, how in this kind of disruption, the best in human beings can come forward easily. Now, how do we take advantage of that in terms of our organizations and so on? So we created an interview guide that would be used in a summit around this pandemic, and how to build resilience within the pandemic and how to prepare for a better future post-pandemic. But the key in all of this is co-creation with all the emotions we all feel, the fear, the bankruptcy potentials, the not knowing whether I'm ever going to be able to come back to that job and so on. The fear, the anxiety. As a leader, you have to think through, how do we create conditions that can allow us to access our better selves? And so my answer to that is that we can't do it through telling and selling, I mean, we need some good communications and so on at this time. I don't think we can even do it through consultation. Employees give us some advice. I think the only way to recover agency and footing and strength is by co-creation, is by bringing people together to actually co-create that future. So I think there's incredible potential in learning how to do the appreciative inquiry summits online in Zoom with all the capabilities that are there. We began to pilot some of the questions that would be used. We did this with the Cleveland Clinic, leaders at the Cleveland Clinic, with Progressive Insurance, with SwageLock, and the dialogues in this kind of environment have just been incredible. I'll just read a couple of the questions that I would use if I were a company in the midst of this kind of pandemic. The first question, and as you all know, in appreciative inquiry, framing what that topic is and reframing it to get to a point where we are embracing the potential of that group. And so what I called the interview guide was moments of magnified meaning making. And just a couple examples of some questions here. Um, and organizations everywhere have entered a new reality that few of us would have imagined at the start of 2020. In the span of several months, the COVID pandemic has irrevocably transformed economies and organizations around the world, infected millions, and will tragically result in unpredictable numbers of deaths. And yet, moments like this do perhaps open opportunities for shifts, big and small. But openings do not last forever. And one way to keep such openings vital and expansive is to magnify meaningful stories through conversations with others. So some questions in these pairs that we piloted in terms of what you're experiencing in these days and recent weeks, what is the most important thing stirring in you right now? And how do you sense it relates to our future, your most important hopes, or our larger sense of purpose? B, all around the world, we are seeing people on the front lines of care in hospitals, in our communities, and in our businesses everywhere we look, and we see people responding in courageous, caring, unexpected ways. If you could put the spotlight on just one or two of the most powerful stories you've seen or heard, about one in society and one in our organization, examples that provide you with an image, inspiration, or new understanding of we as human beings and what we're capable of together. What two stories or examples would you put a spotlight on? And then the last part of this first question, now, in your view, at the largest level for our world and our country overall, what possible good can come from this crisis, this tragedy, this moment of response? And then the questions go through some questions about looking at the past and lifting up those two or three things that we as an organization coming out of this pandemic, no matter how much we change, and we know we have to change, what are two or three of those most powerful things that we want to keep and build? And what are two or three new strengths that are bubbling that have potential that we want to explore as new foundations? And then the question moving towards images of the future, helping them begin to imagine what it would be like and what it could be like 5 or 10 years from now. And then obviously questions around, what's one of the smallest acts we could take today as an organization to move us in the direction of this, and then what one bolder thing should we consider? And as you look at organizations that are doing well in this moment, they're asking questions like that. And they are bringing people together to have planning and so on. So while it might seem like a luxury to do organization development at this time, I think it's absolutely what leaders need to be doing. I think, and part of the reason is that how we lead in these moments of crisis, like Ed Schein in his book on organizational culture talks about the different levels of culture, viewing it like an iceberg. At the top, you've got the artifacts and practices of the day and so on. In the middle, you've got kind of our espoused values. And then at the lower level are our deepest level beliefs. And that's what we know about culture. Cultures are formed in the crucible of crisis. And so to say, oh, we can't do that now because we have to get our senior leadership team together before we bring more voices into it, or we have to stop the bleeding before we can even have a discussion, or, well, wait a second, what if things come up like loss of jobs and so on, tough things? Well, those are things that executives are raising, but what they're missing in that process is the enormous capacity to tap in to the very, very best in human beings. And it comes out during these moments, our true colors as a company, as a community, as a nation. And so that's what I want to encourage. If there's any way that we can continue to grow and share our knowledge, I know Michelle will share the little article I wrote on that. But what I want to say is I think this is the most powerful time to do this work. And of course, the lessons, hopefully, in terms of resilience and new forms of collaboration, how human character strengths can grow and we can extend them more frequently into our futures, altruism, wisdom, courage, and so on. I think that we have a tremendous opportunity to learn with each other and to grow these things. And I'll just leave you with a little excerpt from the Leonard Cohen's song. He passed away, and about 2 months ago in Denmark, I got a chance to go to a celebration of his work, but I love it. And it's from a song called Anthem. And he says, "Ring the bells that still can ring, forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. There's a crack in everything, but that's how the light gets in." So I will hand it back to Michelle to continue the discussion here, but I just want to say I do think this is a time that's calling for the best in our thinking on how to bring people together, to make resilience happen in the moment. So resiliencing as opposed to the word resilience, and harness this time for companies and organizations, communities, cities, whole industries to capture a better vision of their true colors.
Awesome.